I adjusted the rifle strap across my shoulder and checked my watch. Nearly 4 hours into the hunt, and I hadn't seen so much as a deer track worth following. The October morning had started with that perfect crispness that every hunter knows. Cold enough to keep the scent down, but not so bitter that your fingers went numb around the trigger. 33 years of hunting had taught me patience, though. I'd tracked elk through terrain that would send most people scrambling back to their trucks, faced down charging bears, and spent enough nights in the wilderness to know when something felt off. Today wasn't one of those days. Everything felt normal, predictable, even. The rocky outcrop I'd chosen for my glassing position gave me a clear view of the valley below and the ridge system running north through the pine forest. Yellowstone's backcountry didn't see many hunters this deep, which meant the elk hadn't been spooked by weekend warriors blasting away at shadows. I'd left Dale back in town for this trip. Sometimes you needed the quiet that only came with hunting alone. I pulled the binoculars from my chest pack and settled into a comfortable position against the boulder behind me. The weight of the 3006 rested familiar and reassuring across my knees. In 3 decades of hunting, I'd learned to trust my equipment and my instincts equally. Both had kept me alive through encounters that would have ended badly for less experienced hunters. The valley spread out below me like a textbook hunting ground. Dense stands of lodgepole pine gave way to open meadows where elk loved to feed in the early morning and late afternoon. A small creek wound through the bottom, providing the water source that kept game moving through this corridor regularly. I'd studied the topographical maps for weeks before this trip, marking the natural funnels and feeding areas where a patient hunter could intercept a bull moving between bedding and feeding areas. Movement caught my eye on the ridge about 200 yards above my position. I raised the binoculars and focused on the spot where I'd seen something dark pass between the trees. Another hunter, most likely. The figure moved again, and I tracked it through the lenses as it stepped into a small clearing between 2 massive pines. The dark clothing made sense for October hunting, but something about the way the person stood bothered me. I adjusted the focus ring and tried to get a clearer look. The distance and the pine branches created a confusing mix of shadows and filtered light that made details difficult to pick out. When the figure turned slightly in my direction, I realized why my instincts had been nagging at me. The proportions weren't right, not even close. I lowered the binoculars and blinked hard, figuring the magnification and angle were playing tricks on my eyes. Heat waves could distort images at distance, and I'd seen plenty of rocks and stumps that looked like animals until you got a better angle. But this was October in the mountains. No heat waves and the air was crystal clear. I raised the binoculars again and found the figure immediately. It hadn't moved from the clearing. And now I could see it clearly enough to understand why my brain had been rejecting what my eyes were showing me. The thing stood nearly 8 feet tall, but its frame looked stretched and wrong, like someone had taken a normal person and pulled them out of proportion. The limbs seemed too long for the torso, giving it an unsettling spidery appearance that made my stomach clench. Dark fur covered its entire body, thick and coarse, looking even at this distance. I steadied the binoculars against the rock and focused more carefully on what I really hoped was just an optical illusion. The creature's head turned slightly, and I caught sight of its face in profile. No lips that I could see, just exposed teeth that looked yellowed and oversized. When it shifted to face more directly toward me, its eyes became visible. They glowed, not reflected light or a trick of the sun filtering through the trees. They actually glowed with an amber color that seemed to burn in the shadows of its face. The intensity of that gaze made me feel like I was being studied, measured, evaluated by something that definitely wasn't human. I lowered the binoculars again, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to process what I'd just seen. 3 decades of hunting experience had shown me bears standing on their hind legs, elk moving through dark timber, and plenty of other wildlife that could fool you at distance. This wasn't any of those things. My mouth had gone dry and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale slowly and raised the binoculars one more time, half expecting to find the clearing empty and my sanity intact. The creature remained exactly where I'd last seen it, motionless among the pines, and those terrible amber eyes seemed to be looking directly at me across the 200 yards of forest. I kept the binoculars trained on the creature for what felt like hours, though my watch told me only 20 minutes had passed since I'd first spotted it. My arms HDHD from holding the binoculars steady, and my rifle had grown heavy across my knees. The smart thing would have been to pack up and leave. 33 years of hunting had taught me to respect what I didn't understand, and this definitely fell into that category. But something kept me frozen in place. Maybe professional curiosity. Maybe just stubborn disbelief that what I was seeing could actually be real. I needed proof. Something more concrete than my own rattled nerves and a story no one would believe. My phone sat in my jacket pocket and I pulled it out with hands that shook more than I wanted to admit. The camera app opened easily enough and I switched to maximum zoom. The creature appeared on the small screen, blurry, but unmistakably there. Not a bear, not an elk, not any kind of optical illusion my mind could rationalize away. I steadied my elbows against the boulder and tapped the camera button. The artificial shutter sound seemed to echo across the valley, way too loud for comfort. The creature's head snapped toward me with mechanical precision. Even at 200 yards, I could see those yellow eyes lock onto my position with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The thing had heard that tiny electronic sound and pinpointed my location immediately. I lowered the phone and grabbed the binoculars again, needing the magnification to confirm what I was seeing. The creature had begun moving down the ridge. Its movements defied everything I knew about navigating rough terrain where I would have had to pick my way carefully between boulders and deadfall, testing each step for stability. This thing flowed like water. It bounded from rock to rock with fluid grace, never seeming to check its footing or adjust for the uneven ground. When dense pine branches blocked its path, it wove through them without slowing down, never catching its dark fur on the sharp needles. I watched it cover ground that should have taken 15 minutes in less than 3. Each leap carried it 20 feet or more, and its long limbs absorbed the impact of landing without any visible strain. The creature moved with purpose and intelligence, choosing the most efficient route down the steep slope while maintaining its direct course toward my position, toward me. That realization hit like cold water to the face. This wasn't random movement or simple animal behavior. The thing was deliberately heading in my direction, and it was covering the distance between us at a pace that made my stomach drop. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and grabbed my rifle, working the bolt to chamber around. The familiar mechanical action should have been comforting, but my hands were shaking too badly to feel confident about making any kind of precision shot. Not that I knew what I'd be shooting at or whether a 3006 round would even stop something like this. My backpack went over my shoulders in one quick motion, and I abandoned my comfortable position against the boulder. The hunting route I'd planned for the day became irrelevant. Getting distance between myself and that creature was the only thing that mattered now. I started down the backside of the rocky outcrop, away from the valley where the thing was making its approach. The terrain here was rougher, all loose scree and twisted pine roots that grabbed at my boots, but it offered the fastest route away from my current position. After 50 yards of scrambling downhill, I paused behind a cluster of massive boulders to check my progress. I pulled out the binoculars and scanned the ridge where I'd last seen the creature. It was gone. My heart hammered as I swept the lenses back and forth across the tree-in, searching for any sign of movement. The clearing where it had stood was empty, and I couldn't spot it anywhere on the ridge face. For a moment, I let myself hope that maybe it had lost interest and wandered off. Then I caught sight of dark movement in my peripheral vision and turned the binoculars toward the valley floor. The creature was there, much closer than it should have been possible to get in such a short time. It had cut across the terrain at an angle, positioning itself between me and the main trail back to the parking area. I changed direction, heading north along the ridgeline instead of continuing downhill. The creature adjusted immediately, moving through the trees below me with that same impossible speed. Every route I considered, it seemed to anticipate, positioning itself to cut off my escape options. When I veered east toward a different trail system, the creature paralleled my movement. When I doubled back west, thinking I could circle around behind it, the thing was already there waiting. It was reading my intention somehow, staying one step ahead of every decision I made. My lungs burned from the altitude and exertion, and sweat had soaked through my hunting jacket. I needed to rest, to think, to figure out some kind of strategy beyond just running blindly through the forest. A massive pine tree offered cover, its thick trunk easily wide enough to hide behind. I pressed my back against the rough bark and tried to control my breathing while I worked out my next move. The rifle felt slick in my sweaty palms, and I had to wipe my hands on my jacket before I trusted my grip. I counted to 10, then leaned around the tree trunk to check the creature's position. It stood motionless among the pines about 100 yards away, not moving, not searching, just standing there like it had known exactly where I would stop. Those terrible yellow eyes were fixed on my position. And even at this distance, I could see the intelligence behind them. The thing was studying me, watching my reactions, learning my patterns, figuring out how I moved and fought. This wasn't some mindless predator following instinct. This was something that understood strategy and psychological pressure. I pulled back behind the tree, my mind racing. Every time I'd changed direction, the creature had been ready. Every escape route I'd considered, it had already blocked. It was deliberately hurting me, controlling my movements, keeping me within some invisible boundary it had established. The horrible truth settled in my gut like a lead weight. This wasn't a chase. It was a game. The creature was toying with me, and I was completely outmatched. My legs burned and my lungs felt ready to burst as I scrambled over another fallen log. 30 minutes of running through this terrain had pushed me past exhaustion into something approaching panic. The creature kept pace effortlessly, sometimes disappearing completely, only to reappear in my peripheral vision moments later. Every time I thought I'd lost it, those amber eyes would materialize between the trees, watching me with that same calculating intelligence. I fumbled for the radio clipped to my belt, nearly dropping it as my sweaty fingers worked the controls. The static crackled to life, and I pressed the transmit button with more force than necessary. "Dale, are you there? Dale, come in." The response came through immediately. Dale's familiar voice cutting through the static. "Richard, that you? You sound like hell, buddy. Dale, I need you to listen to me." My voice cracked despite my efforts to sound calm. "I'm in serious trouble out here. I need you to bring your truck and your rifle now." A pause. Then Dale's laugh echoed through the radio speaker. "What did you do? Stumble into a bear den? You know better than to get that close to a mama with cubs. It's not a bear." I checked over my shoulder while talking, spotting movement in the shadows about 60 yards back. There's something following me. Something wrong. I can't explain it over the radio, but I need backup. "Richard, slow down. You're not making sense. What kind of something?" I stopped running and pressed my back against a thick pine trunk, trying to catch my breath enough to speak clearly. "Dale, I've been hunting for 33 years. I know every animal in these mountains. This isn't any of them. It's been chasing me for half an hour, and it's smart. Too smart." The static stretched between us while Dale processed what I'd said. When he spoke again, the humor had left his voice. "You're serious? Dead serious? I'm sending you my GPS coordinates now." I worked the controls on my GPS unit with shaking hands, transmitting my location through the radio's data feature. "How fast can you get here? I'm already grabbing my keys. Give me an hour, maybe a little less, if the road's not too rough. Can you hold out that long?" I peered around the tree trunk and immediately spotted the creature standing motionless between two pines. It made no effort to hide anymore, just watched me with those horrible glowing eyes. I need to find somewhere defensible and wait this out. Copy that. Find high ground if you can. Something with your back protected. I'm rolling now with the 3006. Keep the radio on channel 3. Thanks, Dale. And hurry. The radio went quiet except for the background static. I clipped it back to my belt and surveyed the terrain around me. About 200 yards uphill, a cluster of massive boulders jutted from the slope like the spine of some buried giant. The rocks stood 15 feet high in places, offering both elevation and protection. If I could reach them, I'd have a defensible position with clear sight lines in all directions. The creature hadn't moved from its position between the pines. It seemed content to watch me think through my options, like it was curious to see what I'd do next. That patient intelligence made my skin crawl worse than any snarling beast would have. I broke from cover and ran uphill toward the boulder formation, zigzagging between trees to avoid giving the creature a clear view of my route. My boot slipped on the loose pine needles covering the steep slope, but I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that those amber eyes were tracking my every step. The climb up the largest boulder required both hands, forcing me to sling the rifle across my back. The rock face was rough granite, scarred by decades of weather, providing enough handholds to reach the top. I hauled myself over the edge and immediately turned to scan the forest below. The creature had vanished. I pulled the rifle off my shoulder and worked the bolt, making sure a round was chambered. The metallic click echoed off the surrounding rocks. From my elevated position, I could see for hundreds of yards in every direction, but the dense pine forest offered countless hiding spots for something that moved like smoke through the trees. Minutes ticked by in absolute silence. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through the pine needles. The forest held its breath around me, waiting for something to happen. Movement caught my eye about 100 yards to the east. The creature stepped from behind a cluster of deadfall, completely exposed in a small clearing. It stood perfectly still, those terrible eyes fixed on my position atop the boulder. When I raised the rifle and sighted through the scope, the creature took 3 deliberate steps backward, putting more distance between us. I lowered the weapon and the creature stepped forward again. My hands tightened around the rifle stock as understanding hit me. The thing knew exactly what the weapon meant. It understood the threat and was staying just beyond effective range for a clean shot. This wasn't instinct or coincidence. This was strategy. I tried the test again, raising the rifle slowly. The creature immediately retreated, moving with fluid grace until it reached the cover of larger trees. When I lowered the weapon, it emerged and crept closer, stopping at the edge of the same clearing. The creature began moving again, but not toward me this time. It circled around the base of the boulder formation, staying just within sight, but always maintaining that careful distance. Its movements were deliberate and methodical, like it was mapping every approach route to my position. I tracked it with the rifle scope as it completed its circuit. The magnification let me see details that made my stomach clench. The coarse dark fur was patchy in places, revealing mottled gray skin underneath. Its face was a nightmare blend of human and animal features with elongated proportions that looked wrong from every angle. The fingers ended in thick yellowed claws that could probably tear through flesh like paper. When the creature completed its circle and returned to the original clearing, it settled into a crouch. Not hiding, not preparing to charge, just waiting. Those amber eyes never left my position, and I could feel the weight of its attention like a physical presence. 20 minutes had passed since my first radio call to Dale. The psychological warfare continued with the creature testing my defenses while staying just beyond rifle range. Every time I raised the weapon, it would retreat. When I lowered it, the thing crept closer again, never attacking, but never leaving. The radio crackled with Dale's voice. "Richard, you copy? How are you holding up?" I keyed the transmit button while keeping my eyes on the creature. "I'm on high ground now, defensible position. But Dale, this thing is smart. It knows what my rifle can do." "What do you mean?" "Every time I aim at it, it backs off. When I lower the weapon, it comes closer. It's been doing this for 20 minutes now." Static filled the air before Dale responded. "That doesn't sound like any animal behavior I've heard of." "That's because it's not an animal." "Not really." I watched the creature tilt its massive head, studying my position like it was looking for weaknesses in my defensive setup. "How much longer?" "About 40 minutes still. Rough road slowing me down." "You got enough ammunition?" I checked the magazine in my rifle and patted the extra boxes in my jacket pockets. "Plenty. Just get here fast." The sun had moved noticeably since I'd climbed onto the rocks. The shadows were longer now, and the forest below me had taken on the golden hue that meant late afternoon was sliding toward evening. In a few hours, darkness would make my elevated position useless. The creature would have every advantage once I couldn't see it coming. Another 20 minutes crawled by. The creature maintained its patient vigil, occasionally shifting position, but never straying far from the clearing. It seemed content to wait, testing my resolve with that unblinking amber stare. The intelligence behind those eyes was unmistakable. This thing was thinking, planning, waiting for the right moment. My radio crackled again. "Richard, still there? Still here? Still being watched. I'm making better time now. 20 minutes out, maybe less. Can you see the logging road from your position?" I scanned the terrain to the south and spotted a dirt track winding through the trees about half a mile away. "Yeah, I can see it." "Good. I'll come in from that direction. Make some noise so you know it's me. This thing giving you any trouble or just playing the staring game?" I looked down at the creature, still crouched in the clearing with its unblinking amber gaze fixed on my boulder. "Just staring. But Dale, I don't think it's going to stay patient much longer. The way it's looking at me, it's planning something." "Roger that. Keep your rifle ready and don't do anything brave. I'll be there soon." The radio went quiet, leaving me alone with the growing shadows in the creature's relentless observation. 20 more minutes. I could hold this position for 20 more minutes, even if every instinct screamed at me to run. The boulder beneath me felt solid and reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped rather than protected. The creature shifted slightly, adjusting its position in the clearing. Its head tilted at a different angle, and for a moment, I thought it might be losing interest. Then those terrible eyes refocused on me with renewed intensity, and I realized my hope had been premature. It was still hunting, still waiting for the right moment to make its move. The rumble of Dale's truck engine carried through the trees like salvation. I'd been tracking the sound for the last 5 minutes as it wound up the Forest Service road, getting closer with each gear change. My watch showed that exactly 1 hour had passed since Dale's radio call promising 20 minutes. The rough mountain roads had slowed him down more than expected. I scrambled down from the boulder formation, my legs stiff from sitting in the same defensive position for so long. The rifle felt heavier than usual as I slung it across my shoulder and jogged toward the approaching engine noise. Every few steps, I turned to check the forest behind me, but the creature had vanished the moment that first engine sound echoed through the valley. Dale's dark blue pickup appeared between the pine trunks, bouncing over ruts and exposed roots as he navigated the narrow service road. The sight of that familiar truck and the sound of its reliable V8 engine made my chest loosen for the first time in hours. I wasn't alone anymore. The truck stopped about 50 yards from where the road dead-ended at a small turnaround area. Dale stepped out carrying his .306 rifle, the same model I carried, but with a different scope setup. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent decades in these mountains. But I could see his eyes already working the tree out of habit. "Richard." His voice carried easily in the still air. "You look like hell, buddy." I jogged the remaining distance between us, checking over my shoulder twice before reaching the truck. "Thanks for coming. I know how this sounds, but whoa." Dale held up a hand, his expression shifting as he got a better look at my face. Whatever skepticism he'd brought with him started evaporating when he saw my sweat-soaked shirt and the way my hand shook slightly around the rifle grip. "What happened to you out here?" I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and opened the camera app. The photos I'd taken were still there. Blurry, shaky images that showed something dark standing between the pines. Distance and my adrenaline-fueled camera work had made them inconclusive, but they were proof that something had been out there. "Look at these." I handed him the phone. "I took them about an hour ago, maybe a little more." Dale studied the screen, using his thumb to zoom in on different parts of each image. His face stayed neutral, but I could see him working through what the pictures might show. After cycling through all 6 photos twice, he handed the phone back. "Okay, that's definitely something." He looked up at me, then back at the phone screen. "But Richard, These could be anything. Tree shadow, another hunter, maybe a bear standing up. I know what I saw. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. 8 foot tall, wrong proportions, amber eyes that glowed. It followed me for over an hour, staying just out of rifle range. Every time I aimed at it, the thing would back off. When I lowered the weapon, it came closer. Dale's expression grew more serious as he processed what I'd said. He'd known me long enough to recognize when I was genuinely rattled. And 33 years of hunting together meant he trusted my ability to identify wildlife. You're sure it wasn't a bear? Big male can get close to 8 feet when they rear up. Dale, I've seen hundreds of bears. This wasn't one. I gestured toward the valley where I'd first spotted the creature. It moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, and it was thinking, planning, testing my defenses. He nodded slowly, accepting my assessment, even if he couldn't fully understand it. All right, what's the plan? Get back to your truck and get out of here fast. I started walking toward the service road, staying close enough to Dale that we could cover each other. I've had enough wilderness adventure for one day. Dale fell into step beside me, holding his rifle at ready position while scanning the pine forest around us. The familiar weight of his presence made the forest feel less threatening, though I still found myself checking the shadows between trees for any sign of movement. You really think this thing was hunting you? Dale asked as we picked our way down a steep section of the trail. I don't think it. I know it was. The way it moved, the way it watched me, the way it stayed just outside effective range. That's not animal behavior. That's strategy. We covered the first quarter mile without incident. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine canopy, creating patches of golden light and deep shadow that would normally make for perfect hunting conditions. Now, every shifting shadow made me tense. Every rustle of wind through the needles sounded like potential movement. Where exactly did you first spot it? Dale asked, keeping his voice low. I pointed toward the ridge system running north through the valley. Up there, about 200 yards from where I was sitting, standing in a clearing between 2 big pines, just watching me through binoculars, and it came down the ridge toward you, like water flowing downhill. Never seemed to check its footing. Never got tangled in branches. Covered terrain that should have taken 15 minutes in about 3. I paused to scan the forest ahead of us, looking for any sign of the creature lurking between trees. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. We'd covered roughly half the distance back to Dale's truck, and I was starting to feel like maybe the creature had given up its pursuit. Maybe the sound of the truck engine and the presence of a second armed person had convinced it to find easier prey somewhere else. Dale stepped over a fallen log and turned to offer me a hand across. Well, if this thing is real and it's gone, I'd say we both earned a drink tonight. Hell, I'll buy the first round just for making this trip without finding Bigfoot. He grinned at his own joke, the tension finally starting to leave his shoulders. The familiar sound of Dale's humor made the whole situation feel less like a nightmare and more like just another hunting story we'd tell around a campfire. Maybe he was right. Maybe the worst was over. I laughed despite everything. Dale's joke cutting through the tension that had been building in my chest for the past hour. Yeah, well, let's hope we never have to. The creature exploded from the tree in 50 yards ahead of us. Dale's rifle clattered to the ground as he froze mid-step, his mouth falling open. I watched his face go through the same progression mine had hours earlier. Confusion. Disbelief, then raw terror as his brain processed what he was seeing. The thing stood in the clearing exactly as I described it. But seeing it in person was different from hearing about it. 8 feet of wrong proportions and nightmare anatomy with those terrible amber eyes now locked onto Dale with predatory focus. Jesus Christ, Dale whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature tilted its massive head, studying Dale like a curious dog, examining something new. Then it began to move. The thing launched itself forward with terrifying speed, its elongated limbs carrying it across the rough ground in bounding leaps that covered impossible distances. Each stride ate up 20 feet of forest floor, its clawed hands and feet finding purchase on rocks and logs without any apparent effort. The fluid grace I'd witnessed on the ridge was nothing compared to seeing it charge in open ground. "Dale, run!" I shouted, but my friend was already moving. Dale spun and sprinted back toward me, abandoning his rifle in his panic. His face had gone white, and I could see the same primal terror in his eyes that I'd felt when this nightmare first started. Behind him, the creature closed the distance with inhuman quickness, its long limbs pumping in a rhythm that looked wrong for any earthly predator. I raised my rifle and sighted through the scope, but both targets were moving too fast for a clean shot. Dale weaved between trees in blind panic while the creature adjusted its path with calculated precision, cutting off his escape routes, just like it had done to me. The thing was only 10 yards behind Dale now, close enough that I could hear the soft thuds of its feet hitting the ground. "Get down!" I screamed, hoping Dale would hear me over his own ragged breathing. He either didn't hear or was too terrified to process the command. Dale stumbled over a fallen log, his feet tangling in the dead branches, and went down hard. He rolled onto his back, scrambling backward with his hands and feet, leaves and pine needles sticking to his jacket. The creature reached him in 2 more bounds and stopped. It stood over Dale's prone form, towering above him like some ancient predator examining cornered prey. The massive head tilted first one way, then the other. Those burning amber eyes studying Dale's face with unmistakable intelligence. Not hunting now, examining, learning. The same calculating patience it had shown while watching me from the clearing. I lined up my shot, finger tightening on the trigger. At this range, maybe 40 yards, I couldn't miss. The creature's broad back filled my scope, and I squeezed off the round. The bullet winded past the creature's shoulder, clipping bark from a pine tree behind it. My hands were shaking worse than I'd realized, and the adrenaline had thrown off my aim. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest, sharp and violent in the afternoon air. The creature's head snapped toward me, amber eyes finding my position instantly. It stepped back from Dale, but didn't flee like I'd expected. Instead, it watched me work the bolt action on my rifle, its elongated face showing what might have been curiosity about my weapon. I fired again, the rifle bucking against my shoulder. This time, the bullet struck home, punching into the creature's left shoulder and spinning it halfway around. Black blood sprayed across the pine needles in a wide arc, and the metallic smell hit me even from 40 yards away. The creature staggered, but remained upright, that terrible intelligence never leaving its eyes. It turned those horrible yellow orbs back toward me, and its lipless mouth stretched wide. The yellowed teeth became fully visible, arranged in a grin that held no warmth or humor, just cold predatory amusement, like it had decided this game was about to become much more interesting. The creature's predatory grin lasted exactly 2 seconds before it pivoted away from Dale and launched itself straight at me. I'd never seen anything move that fast. The wounded shoulder didn't slow it down. If anything, the injury seemed to fuel its rage. Those impossibly long limbs propelled it across the forest floor in bounding strides that covered massive chunks of ground with each leap. 30 yards became 20, then 15, faster than my brain could process what was happening. My hands found the rifle bolt automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The metallic click of the action cycling seemed impossibly loud as I chambered another round. The creature's amber eyes never left mine during its charge, burning with focused hatred that made my blood freeze. 15 feet close enough to see the black blood matting the fur around its wounded shoulder. Close enough to smell that metallic stench rolling off its body. Close enough to count the yellowed teeth in that awful lipless mouth. I squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the forest, and the bullet punched into the center of the creature's forehead with a wet thud. Its massive head snapped backward like someone had yanked it with invisible rope. But its body kept coming. Pure momentum carried those long legs forward in 3 more stumbling steps before physics finally won. The thing pitched face first into the pine needles with a sound like a tree falling. Its limbs twitched once, twice, then went completely still. Black blood pooled beneath its shattered skull, soaking into the forest floor in an expanding dark stain. I kept my rifle trained on the motionless form, finger still on the trigger, waiting for any sign of movement. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep the scope steady. Nothing. The creature lay sprawled across the ground like a broken puppet. Arms and legs twisted at angles that looked even more wrong in death than they had in life. "Dale," I called without taking my eyes off the body. "Yeah," his voice came out shaky, but he was already getting to his feet behind me. "Yeah, I think so." I heard him brush pine needles and debris off his jacket. Then his footsteps approached my position. Dale stopped beside me and I could feel him staring at the creature's corpse with the same mixture of disbelief and horror that was churning in my own gut. "Is it dead?" he asked. "Looks like it." I worked the bolt again, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round just in case. "But let's make sure before we get any closer." We stood there for a full minute, watching for any sign of breathing or movement. The forest had gone completely silent again. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the occasional drip of black blood hitting the ground. Finally, I lowered my rifle, but kept it ready. "Come on, but stay back until we know for sure." We approached the body slowly, each step deliberate and careful. Dale had retrieved his rifle from where he dropped it during his panic. And now he held it at the ready position while I took point, 20 feet away. 15-10. The metallic smell of the creature's blood got stronger with each step, making my stomach clench. Up close, the thing was even worse than I'd imagined. The dark fur covering its body was coarse and patchy, more like wire bristles than animal hair. Underneath the sparse coating, mottled gray skin showed through in irregular patches, giving it the appearance of something diseased or rotting. The proportions that had looked wrong from a distance were absolutely nightmarish at close range. Arms and legs that stretched too long for the torso, joints that bent at angles that seemed anatomically impossible. Its face was the worst part. The bullet had done its work, leaving a crater where the forehead used to be, but enough remained intact to see what we'd been dealing with. The skull was elongated, stretched out like someone had grabbed a human head and pulled it through a funhouse mirror. No lips meant the yellow teeth were permanently exposed in that horrible grin, and the eye sockets were too large, too deep, housing those amber orbs that had thankfully lost their inner fire. "Jesus," Dale whispered, crouching down for a better look. "What is this thing?" I knelt beside him, close enough to see details that made my skin crawl. The fingers, if you could call them that, ended in thick yellowed claws that looked capable of tearing through flesh and bone with ease. The muscular frame beneath the patchy fur suggested tremendous strength, the kind of power that could snap a human neck without effort. I have no idea. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, making sure to capture the creature from multiple angles. "But we need documentation, lots of it." Dale stood up and walked around to the creature's feet, then started pacing off the distance from head to toe. 70-11 in, he announced when he finished. "Maybe 8 feet, even if you account for the head being tilted." I continued photographing, getting close-ups of the claws, the facial features, the patchy fur. Each image seemed impossible even as I was taking it, like I was documenting something that couldn't exist in the same world as pickup trucks and hunting licenses. "Richard." Dale's voice had a strange quality to it. "Look at this." I moved around to where he was standing near the creature's midsection. He was pointing at the area where clothing should have been, but there was nothing. No fabric, no tools, no jewelry, nothing that suggested human intelligence or civilization. "It's completely naked," Dale said. "No gear, no weapons, nothing. Just whatever this is." I crouched down and examined the areas Dale was indicating. He was right. Despite the creature's obvious intelligence and strategic thinking, there was no evidence of technology or culture. No clothing meant no pockets, no place to carry tools or weapons. Yet, it had demonstrated problem-solving abilities and tactical awareness that went far beyond animal instinct. The black blood pooling beneath the body had that metallic smell that was making both of us nauseous. I pulled my jacket over my nose and mouth, but the stench seemed to seep through the fabric. Anyway, taking a few more photos with Dale's phone to make sure we had backup documentation. "Load it into your truck and figure out what to do next." Dale looked at the creature's massive frame, then at his pickup truck, visible through the trees. "That thing's got to weigh at least 300 pounds, maybe more. Then we drag it. I slung my rifle across my shoulder and grabbed the creature's ankles, trying not to think about how wrong they felt in my hands. Come on. The sooner we get this to the authorities, the sooner someone smarter than us can figure out what the hell we just killed. The creature's body felt like trying to move a refrigerator full of concrete. Dale grabbed the ankles while I hooked my arms under what passed for shoulders, and we managed to lift maybe 6 in before my back screamed in protest. The thing's limbs hung at weird angles, making it impossible to get a proper grip. And every time we adjusted our hold, those yellowed claws scraped against our jackets. This is insane, Dale grunted, setting his end down after we'd managed maybe 10 feet. How does something this skinny weigh so much? I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of that metallic-smelling blood across my skin. The creature's torso felt dense, like its bones were made of lead instead of calcium. We'd been at this for 5 minutes and barely made progress toward the truck. Maybe the bones are different, I said, though I had no idea what I was talking about. Denser than ours. Dale nodded like that made perfect sense, probably because we were both desperate for any explanation that didn't involve admitting we'd killed something that shouldn't exist. We repositioned ourselves and tried again, this time managing to drag the body about 20 feet before my arms gave out completely. The truck seemed miles away instead of 50 yards. Every few minutes, we'd stop to rest and I'd check the photos on my phone again, making sure the evidence was still there. The images looked even more surreal now that I was staring at the actual corpse, but they captured enough detail to prove we weren't sharing some kind of breakdown. You think there are more of them? Dale asked during one of our breaks. I looked around the forest, scanning the tree in for any sign of movement. The thought had been nagging at me since I'd pulled the trigger. If this thing existed, what were the odds it was the only one? I don't know, I said, but I'm not sticking around to find out. It took us another 15 minutes to cover the remaining distance. By the time we reached Dale's truck, both of us were soaked with sweat and breathing hard. The creature's dead weight had fought us every step of the way, and my shoulders felt like I'd been hauling logs all day. The real challenge came when we tried to lift the body into the truck bed. Dale climbed up first and grabbed the shoulders while I pushed from below, but the height difference made everything 10 times harder. The creature's head lolled back at an angle that made my stomach clench, and those amber eyes had clouded over into something that looked like dirty glass. On 3, Dale said. 1, 2. We heaved together and somehow managed to get the torso over the tailgate. The rest of the body followed in a tangle of wrong-angled limbs that made awful scraping sounds against the truck bed. Dale immediately jumped down and started digging through his emergency kit, pulling out a blue tarp that he shook out with shaking hands. Cover it up, he said. I don't want to look at that thing any longer than I have to. I helped him spread the tarp over the entire length of the creature, making sure every part was hidden. The shape underneath still looked wrong, too long, too angular, but at least those horrible features were out of sight. Dale pulled bungee cords from his toolkit, and we secured the corners, pulling everything tight enough that nothing could shift during transport. Where's the nearest ranger station? I asked as we climbed into the cab. Dale started the engine and checked his GPS. Jackson, about 40 miles southeast. The truck pulled away from the Forest Service road with a sense of finality that made my chest tighten. Whatever had happened back there felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The normal world of hunting licenses and game wardens suddenly seemed impossibly far away. Dale's knuckles stayed white around the steering wheel as we navigated the mountain roads. I kept my rifle across my lap, loaded and ready, while scanning the trees that pressed close to both sides of the narrow pavement. Every shadow between the pines looked like it might be hiding another creature, and every rustling branch made me tense up. What are we going to tell them? Dale asked after we'd been driving for 20 minutes. I'd been wrestling with the same question since we'd loaded the body. The truth sounded like something out of a bad monster movie. But we had physical evidence this time. A corpse didn't lie, even when the story behind it seemed impossible. The truth, I said. Exactly what happened. Let them figure out what it means. Dale nodded, but I could see the worry in his profile. You think they'll believe us? They'll have to once they see the body. The mountain road wound through valleys and over ridges that looked peaceful in the moonlight. Nothing like the nightmare landscape where we'd fought for our lives. Other cars passed us occasionally. Normal people heading home from normal jobs. Probably thinking about normal problems like mortgage payments and weekend plans. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos again, studying each image in the truck's dashboard light. The creature's face looked even more disturbing on the small screen, but the details were clear enough to convince anyone with eyes. Those proportions weren't human, weren't animal, weren't anything that belonged in a biology textbook. "You think we're in trouble?" Dale asked. "For shooting it?" I mean, the question had been eating at me, too. Wyoming had strict laws about hunting, and I didn't know if shooting an unknown species counted as poaching or self-defense. But the alternative had been letting that thing tear us apart in the forest. "It was trying to kill us," I said. "That's got to count for something." Dale's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he kept driving. The truck's headlights carved tunnels through the darkness ahead, while the creature's body shifted slightly in the bed behind us every time we took a curve. I tried not to think about what was back there under the tarp, but my imagination kept filling in details that made my skin crawl. Neither of us talked much after that. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made my eyelids heavy, but every time I started to drift off, the truck would hit a bump and I'd jerk awake, remembering what we were transporting. Dale looked like he was fighting the same battle. His eyes stayed fixed on the road with the intense focus of someone who couldn't afford to relax, not even for a second. The radio played softly in the background. Some country station talking about weather and traffic like the world hadn't just become a much stranger and more dangerous place. I checked my watch. 3 o'clock in the morning. We'd been driving for almost 2 hours, which meant we were getting close to Jackson. The thought of finally reaching civilization should have been comforting, but instead it just made me more nervous. How do you walk into a government building and announce you've killed something that's not supposed to exist? "There," Dale said, pointing ahead to where lights appeared between the trees. "That's got to be the town." Jackson spread out in the valley below us, looking like any other small Wyoming community, except for the tourist shops and ski lodges that catered to Yellowstone visitors. The ranger station would be somewhere in the government district, probably near the courthouse and post office. Dale pulled over at a gas station to ask for directions. The clerk behind the counter looked half asleep and gave us a tired explanation about turning left at the stoplight and following the signs. Normal interaction with a normal person who had no idea we were carrying proof that the world contained monsters. The ranger station turned out to be a low brick building with the National Park Service logo mounted beside the front door. A few vehicles sat in the parking lot and lights showed in several windows. Dale parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. We sat there for a moment looking at the building that represented our return to the rational world. I could see movement through the glass doors. Park rangers arriving for their morning shift, carrying coffee cups and looking like they were getting ready for another day of routine paperwork and tourist questions. "Ready?" Dale asked. I looked back at the covered shape in the truck bed, then at the photos on my phone. Physical evidence, undeniable proof. Whatever happened next, at least we wouldn't be dismissed as a couple of drunk hunters making up stories. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go show them what we found." I pushed through the glass doors of the ranger station with Dale right behind me. The familiar smell of institutional coffee and paper filing systems hitting me immediately. 2 rangers looked up from their desks. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail and a younger man with the kind of clean-shaven face that suggested he took the uniform seriously. The woman stood first, her badge reading S. Martinez. She walked over with the practiced friendliness of someone used to dealing with tourists who'd lost their wallets or gotten turned around on hiking trails. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I glanced at Dale, then back at Martinez. "We need to report something. An encounter with an animal, something dangerous." The male ranger joined us, his badge showing K. Thompson. He had the look of someone who'd heard plenty of bear stories from city folk who'd never seen anything bigger than a golden retriever. "What kind of animal?" Martinez asked, pulling out a small notebook. I took a breath and started from the beginning, describing the hunting trip, the first sighting through binoculars, the pursuit through the forest. Both rangers listened with expressions that grew more doubtful as my story progressed. When I got to the part about the creature's intelligence and strategic behavior, Thompson's eyebrows went up in a way that suggested he was fighting not to roll his eyes. So, this creature, Martinez said when I paused. It was approximately 8 foot tall, covered in dark fur, and demonstrated what you're calling strategic thinking. That's right. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. I have photos. Thompson leaned in as I scrolled through the images, his face showing the kind of patience people use with children or confused elderly relatives. The photos looked even worse on the small screen than I remembered. Blurry shapes between trees that could have been anything from a standing bear to a guy in a hunting jacket. These could be a lot of things, Thompson said diplomatically. Bears can reach considerable height when they rear up on their hind legs. Lighting conditions in dense forest can create optical illusions, especially when adrenaline is involved. It wasn't a bear. Dale spoke for the first time since we'd entered the station. I've seen bears. This wasn't one. Martinez made notes in her pad while Thompson studied the photos again. I could see them exchanging glances, the kind of professional communication that happens between people who've worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. Did either of you consume any alcohol during your hunting trip? Thompson asked. No, I said immediately. Nothing like that. Sometimes altitude sickness can cause hallucinations, Martinez added in the tone of someone offering a helpful explanation, especially if you're not acclimated to elevation changes. The reasonable explanations they were offering made sense from their perspective. 2 guys show up at dawn with wild stories and blurry photos claiming they'd encountered something that sounded like it belonged in a monster movie. I probably would have reacted the same way. Look, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I understand how this sounds, but we have physical evidence. The body is in Dale's truck right outside. Both rangers went very still. Martinez looked up from her notebook while Thompson's expression shifted into something more serious. You're saying you killed this animal? Martinez asked. It attacked us. We had no choice. Thompson sat down the phone and crossed his arms. You're claiming you have the body of an unknown species in your vehicle. That's exactly what I'm claiming. The rangers looked at each other again, and I could see them weighing options, probably deciding whether we were dangerous or just crazy. Martinez closed her notebook and nodded toward the door. All right, let's take a look. The 4 of us walked outside into the morning air. Dale's truck sat exactly where we parked it, the blue tarp still stretched tight across the bed. Everything looked normal from the outside, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. Dale walked to the tailgate and started untying the bungee cords. His hands moved with the same careful precision he'd used when securing the tarp in the first place, pulling each cord free and setting it aside. Martinez and Thompson positioned themselves where they could see into the truck bed clearly. Ready? Dale asked, looking at me. I nodded. Dale grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled it back in one smooth motion. The truck bed was empty. I stared at the bare metal surface, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Dark stains covered the bed liner in irregular patches, and tufts of coarse black fur clung to the rigged surface near the wheel wells. But the massive body we'd struggled to load just hours ago was completely gone. What the hell? Dale whispered, leaning over the tailgate to look closer. I walked around to get a better angle, certain that somehow we were looking at the wrong truck or the wrong spot. But the blood stains were exactly where they should be, marking the outline where the creature's torso had rested. The metallic smell I remembered hung in the air, fainter now, but unmistakable. I don't understand, I said, more to myself than anyone else. It was right here. We tied it down. Thompson examined the tufts of fur without touching them while Martinez walked around the truck's perimeter. I could see the skepticism hardening on both their faces, moving from polite doubt into something closer to annoyance. So, You're telling us, Thompson said slowly, that during your 40-mile drive to the station, an 8-foot-tall creature somehow disappeared from your truck bed. It was here, Dale said, his voice getting louder. Right here. We both lifted it. We both saw it. Martinez rejoined the group, her professional expression never wavering. Gentlemen, I understand you believe you experienced something unusual, but these bloodstains could be from a deer or elk. The fur could be from any number of animals. There's no evidence here of the creature you described. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling frantically through the photos. These pictures show blurry shapes in poor lighting, Thompson interrupted. Nothing more. The weight of what was happening settled in my stomach like cold stone. The physical evidence we'd counted on, the one thing that would make our story impossible to dismiss, had vanished without explanation. All we had left were photos that proved nothing and a story that sounded like the product of too much whiskey and too little sleep. Maybe you should avoid the backcountry for a while, Martinez suggested in the kind of gentle tone used with people experiencing mental health crisis. Sometimes the combination of altitude, stress, and isolation can affect perception. There's no shame in it, or dehydration, Thompson added. That can cause some pretty vivid hallucinations. Dale was still staring into the empty truck bed, running his hands along the stained metal surface. I could see him trying to make sense of what had happened, searching for some logical explanation that would bring the world back into focus. This is insane, he muttered. It was right here. But the Rangers had already moved past listening to our protests. They were wrapping up the interaction with the efficiency of people who had dealt with similar situations before. Confused hunters, disoriented hikers, people who'd convinced themselves they'd seen things that existed only in their imaginations. Martinez handed me a business card. If you remember any additional details or if you have any other wildlife encounters, please don't hesitate to contact us. We take all reports seriously. The politeness somehow made it worse than outright dismissal would have been. They were treating us like confused children who needed to be handled carefully and sent on our way. Thompson shook hands with both of us, his grip firm and professional. Take care of yourselves out there. The wilderness can be unpredictable. We stood in the parking lot watching them walk back into the station, probably to file a report about 2 hunters suffering from altitude sickness or substance abuse. The morning traffic moved past us in both directions. People heading to normal jobs, dealing with normal problems, living in a world where the impossible stayed impossible. Dale climbed into the driver's seat without saying anything. I got in beside him and closed the door, sealing us into the quiet space where we could finally acknowledge what had just happened. Where did it go? Dale asked, starting the engine. I had no answer that made sense. 300 pounds of dead weight doesn't disappear from a moving vehicle. Bodies don't vanish into thin air, especially when they're tied down under tarps and secured with bungee cords. We drove through Jackson in silence past the tourist shops and ski lodges that catered to people who thought the biggest danger in Yellowstone was getting lost on a hiking trail. The normal world continued around us exactly as it had before, completely unaware that everything we thought we knew about reality had shifted during the night. No one's ever going to believe us, I said as we reached the edge of town. Dale nodded, his hands tied around the steering wheel. Not ever. The highway stretched ahead of us, leading back toward the mountains, where something impossible had happened and left no trace except bloodstains and scattered fur. I thought about all the hunting trips I'd taken alone over the years. All the times I'd walked into the wilderness with nothing but a rifle, and the confidence that I understood what lived there. That confidence was gone now, replaced by the knowledge that the forest held secrets that defied explanation. Things that existed in the spaces between what science acknowledged and what people were willing to believe. I would never hunt alone again.